And I was impressed when I saw what ACER, yeah, Arusha Climate Environmental Research Center in Tanzania is doing. And they are collaborating with the university as well in Canada. And they did a summer camp on food systems. And through this camp and the documentation of the camp, I learned a lot about their activities. It's a huge piece of land with a lot of diversity. And the interesting thing is that you're working with a lot of people living on that land and being connected to that land for a long time, indigenous people. So I'm keen to hear a bit your story, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, colleagues. Good afternoon. I hope it's already afternoon. Here is already 3 p.m. So I'm based in Arusha, Tanzania, actually, not Nairobi, but of course, our headquarters for East Africa is Nairobi. So Philip is again partly right on that. So my name is Emmanuel Sulle, and I will prefer to go with Sulle, and I will give you a brief presentation about Arusha Climate and Environmental Research Center as a living lab in climate and environment. So instead of focusing on what we do as a field schools and all this stuff, summer school, that's just part of what we will be doing. So my presentation will be largely broad. So if you have any question, please just let me know. And if I'm not audible, please raise your hand, and I will try to be brief, yeah. So as Philip said, this is huge piece of land, and I start this journey by showing you that from the center of Arusha, which is around here, if you can see my cursor, we are sitting around 20 kilometers from the second tallest mountain, that's Mount Meru. So highly ecologically important area. And the area we have here where my office is located is about 3,300 acres of land. It has different activities going on with restoration on 7 hills. We want to make them bring back to water towers and then fertile land also farm, but also protect diversity of wildlife and plants. So in this landscape that I just shown you was established this center called Arusha Climate and Environmental Research Center for many goals, but three of them are important, which is to designate this site as one of the high and exemplary environmental and ecologically important sites where we can conduct research, experiential learning, and innovation in sustainability and environmentalism through a living lab. And I will come back to the living lab next. So our current research are focusing on climate, environmental studies, agroecology, ecology, renewable energy, as well as water. So this center is in nature is transdisciplinary. We are way ahead of disciplinary, multidisciplinary, but really transdisciplinary in the sense that we invite communities and practitioners to co-design, co-implement research with us. That is like taking NGO people and the Maasai agropastoralists to sit with us and innovate things that will be potential for addressing some of the climate and environment challenges. So we work with communities. They not only work as a natural scientist or citizen scientist to collect data on the things that we do in our land and also in the landscape, but we also work with partners because we have a partnership model. So we welcome scientists, researchers who are working in areas that are of interest to us, climate change, renewable energy, modeling climate change, for example, and agroecology and food system. And I will describe more why we have this kind of partnership, because we don't have people inside or within our own entity. Then we also host study abroad summer schools, field schools, and internship programs. That's with our partner universities in Tanzania, abroad, Europe, Canada, and also expanding to US. So coming back to saying that this is a living lab in environment and climate, the story is long, but I can just cut it short. Our founder, His Highness, the late Aga Khan, uh, really understood that for the university and for the entities that he has led, without imparting a critical knowledge to the young people, you can't bring sustainable change. So this center focuses in educating future environmental leaders by giving them the skills, attitudes, and attributes that are necessary for them to bring change in their working environment and make them environmental stewards. And we do that practically. In our university, plastics are banned. So everyone has to get water from dispensers and things like that. So we really try to do things that are possible, and then people can emulate outside that. So all our research are aimed to be accessible and also address the skills that are highly needed in our current environment, and make sure that whatever solutions we come up is accessible to the community, regardless of their financial and geographical barriers. So I mentioned a living lab. This is not new for in European context, but is largely new in African context, particularly in Tanzania. So the point is that the living lab provide what we call people-centered open innovation, ecosystem-based, and here is actually natural settings where we can co-create, integrate research and innovation process in real life of our communities. So if it's pastoralism, you don't think of pastoralism in abstract. You go to the pastoral communities and see what they're actually planting as resilient grants, and then you test from there. But we also understand that at the heart of the living lab is context specificities. You can't just come with a solution thought in a Western context where people are suffering from, let's say, glacier. We don't have glacier here, except in the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. So that's really what we drive, that context specificities, priorities, and the needs of the people inform our research and the solutions we try to. So I just mentioned that partnership is our model. So since I came to these positions just 2 years back, 3 years now, we have signed MOUs with leading universities in Europe, University of Cologne, which has given me global faculty and also projects together. That's how I came to know Philip, as I was already in Cologne, Simon Fraser in Canada, and also the leading Tanzanian university, three of them, UDSM, Sokoine, and Nelson Mandela, as well as the leading World Agroforestry Center in Nairobi, as well as International Livestock Research Center. So these are all partners. The most important thing is we don't just sign MOU and agree to work together. We actually find a niche that brings us together. So with these 5 universities, Simon Fraser and 3 Tanzanian universities, as 5 of us, we have a 5 university consortium. Last year, we had a conference with the theme Beyond Survival, Building Inclusive and Climate Resilience Communities. This is the follow-up of the first meeting after signing MOU, where we had a conference at the University of Dar es Salaam with the theme Water, Health, and Data Analytics in Changing Climate. So we brought together as 5 universities. You can see the vice chancellors of these universities holding the MOUs to really bring them together closer and closer. And this relationship is not just for having conferences, but making sure that the faculty, the students build a relationship, do the student exchanges, internship, trainings together. And we are in a process of expanding this network, getting rid of the name 5 University Consortium to say Universities United for Climate, something like that, because we want to add partners in Europe and other places. So very briefly, our research at this center focuses on climate change. I mentioned initially, but just to show you the landscape that we have restored, and all our research take the aspect of indigenous knowledge and SDGs. Like we must really address poverty as one of the SDG, life on land, but not every aspect we will cover, but at least it should be linked. One thing that we really take seriously on climate change is not just about technicalities of climate change, but the real understanding that the climate change is socially differentiated and must be understood, because the classes, the wealthy and the poor are affected differently. And why is that? Because even in our own African regions, where you have Northwest, Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa, climate change affects us differently if you look at the study by the African Climate Policy Center. Southern Africa, that includes South Africa, Zimbabwe, when the temperature actually increased by 3%, there will be an advantage, while other continents, other parts of the continent will be affected largely, particularly West Africa. So it's really good people to understand so that it brings them to this context. So when we look at the impact of climate change, we really touch the aspect of human health because in this region is so important. People like Maasai, the pastoralists, they are affected psychologically, mentally because of the droughts. You can see where this Canadian student who attended one of the field school, they are stuck with, they can't understand that this Maasai person is living there. You can see the man with the hat is giving them a lecture. This is an indigenous person who we have recruited as an adjunct faculty at this center. He's lecturing them, but they can't believe that there will be a life again in this place when it rains. And I took a photo after it rained that it was lush green, this place. They never believed it. So it's really practical, the knowledge that we try to give. And the reason is East Africa is predicted to be highly vulnerable to flood and heat and droughts. And some of these studies are not done by strangers. Atoli 2022 is our Dean of Medical College based in Nairobi. So we have people who are already looking at these aspects of human health at our own university. But again, most of you have heard Ngorongoro and Serengeti. The picture that I'm showing here is taken in the Ngorongoro crater, where you have the Maasai herders for centuries living together with wild animals, including zebra, giraffe, buffalo, and so forth. But the point is, the land degradation is happening at an unprecedented rate because of not only climate change, but land use changes that is increasing conservation, infrastructure, and so forth. So these are some of the things that we really want to address at this center by working together with local communities. But again, in our own center, we do a number of studies, including soil and land level assessment, because we need to establish this baseline and see what's going to happen after 10 years, after all the restoration that we have been doing in our land. So the pieces you see, the Aga Khan University, where my casa is, where I've just showed 3,300 acres. On the outside, our land is highly degraded, but in our land is at least green. You can see all this, so there's a lot of recovery. There's another piece we have, it's called Two Rivers, because it's surrounded by two rivers. It's highly green. So there's a farming activity throughout the year. So we are really establishing a lot of data that could support most of our long-term research, from soil restoration, biodiversity restoration, and so forth. And then we just had a massive study again, apart from ICRAF that did the soil and land health assessment. We had Tanzania Wildlife Research Institute, which is a government institute to do biodiversity study. And the findings are, of course, mind-blowing. So for example, in this 3,000 acres, we just realized that we have over 146 species of birds, including endangered species like tawny eagle, vulnerable, and of course, African whitebark vulture is highly endangered. So these areas are saving as a refugee, and also migratory birds from Europe are landing in this land. So much could be done in this land. And again, we don't ignore even the important species like pollinators, the bees. And we just did another study, in fact, by the German entomologist working with the Tanzania Wildlife Research Institute. We just mapped this land. You can see the monoculture, the savanna, the yellow, and then green is a monoculture forest. But the findings are, of course, important, where you have green, that's a mixed forest, largely indigenous forest. That's where you have a massive pollinators. And the reasons are very clear. In a mixed forest, indigenous, you have flowers throughout the years, where you have a monocrop like Gravelia, they only bloom some or have flowers in certain time of the year. So a lot of stuff could be done here. And then there's no much chemicals used in the areas that are found in our land, unlike in other places. And then, of course, as I said, most of our research are informed by the needs of the local communities. I can mention one day we visited the Maasai elders and they said, "Oh, we have issues." And we said, "What do you want we us to do as researchers?" They say, "Can you study neglected tropical diseases?" And then produce a tool that the people who cannot read and write can use to disseminate information about the disease. So this is just one example. We have so many other diseases we study. So trachoma, this one page is translated from English to Swahili to Amala. This is Maasai language. So now they know it's transmitted here. This is how you prevent it. This is how you treat it. So we are working, and we will be evaluating the effect or the impact of this tool later this year. And then we also look at the non-apis. These are or we call non-stinging, or we call non-stingless bees, the bees that do not bite. They are different from the honeybees, but they produce, these are small bees that produce a medicinal honey. We look at this and then we train the local farmers, and we also put a lot of bee nests in a different avocado plantation. And this was done by German entomologists that are working with the Tanzania Wildlife uh, Institute. And the idea is just that these research lead to tools that the community will develop. And then without any order, I was just going to mention a few exciting projects. So for example, I'm working on a green economy, asking if people actually know green economy, what does it mean? How do they measure it? But I can't go into that details. But again, we are looking at the impact of climate change on water quality, population health, working with Nelson Mandela. This is what we are doing. We are testing water, taking water from the rivers, taps, and so forth. And then, of course, what we really want is not only to do this systematic laboratory testing, but actually look at what are the existing technologies to treat water so that it could be safe for use in a household or so forth. The reason is, for some of you who have been to Arusha, there's a lot of fluoride and many other things in the water. So as of now, the fluoride levels is still up to 12, in other places up to 20. And the recommended amount is 1.5 milligram per liter. And the problem with the fluoride is that it makes your teeth brownish, bones weak, and there's even association to cancer, particularly esophagus cancer. So those are the studies that we're doing. And we have tools. These results are from the lab developed by one of the professors working at the Nelson Mandela African Institute of Science and Technology. And then waterborne diseases, there's a lot of HP. pylori, amoeba coming up. So the next phase of my research will be on these. And I have one partner, potential partner from the University of Alberta. And then in agriculture, very briefly, these areas are practicing dryland farming. That means one season during rain season. And some of these pastoral communities like the Maasai, they are only using milk and meat as the basic food. But we are introducing perennial vegetable, for example, like tree spinach, which is rich in proteins and vitamins, so that whether cows are there or not, they could access this basic nutrient. And so we train majority of the farmers free. They come on Friday for free for training. And then we have drip irrigation here. We also work with the schools, like this primary school called Naspai is a Maasai. They do permaculture. They're even more advanced than us. And this is our field during dry season. This is a Canadian professor, Indonesian, of course, trying to see what we're trying to do, drip irrigation. And we also work with the government entities dealing with seed management, plant health, to provide what we call led education through exhibitions. So in a year, we have 2 exhibitions where the government entities will come in our land. These are demo plots using very simple technologies, and they will get all the seeds that are indigenous to these areas. Again, I won't talk much about this. We all know that as the temperature exceeded 30 degrees Celsius, Livestock can't even eat. They will have to be hiding under the shade. But what do we do? And then we all know climate change dries up the pasture. So we innovating climate resilient, nutritious grass like banana grass. This is a breed, what do you call it? It's a blend of elephant grass and millet. So we tested in our land, it's growing very well, and we distributed over 33,800 cuttings to nearly 600, and most of them 514 were women. And you will be wondering because there's all these stories, men look after cows, but here, despite the reality that men look after cows, we and in our landscape have allowed women to freely come and cut grasses every day in the morning. But we are now giving these seedlings so that they don't need to come to our land. They can plant this in their gardens and things like that, and they can get this one, solve the issue of pasture. And then we are talking about experiential learning. This is the center of Philip's interest. So we invite students to come for field school, maybe 2 weeks, 1 month, and this could be high school, degrees, masters, and even PhDs. These are high schoolers from Dar es Salaam, from one of the Aga Khan education schools. And of course, you will be surprised that people, some 100, maybe 80% of these students did not know how to plant a cabbage. So not only studying the climate change, but actually you do what can help you get the veggies from your own gardens with the simple technologies like drip irrigation and things like that. So hands-on experience. And then you can see that these, sorry, I'm going to go back. You can see the same students that are planting here, they were listening to a Maasai elder to learn about 40 values of just one tree that we have in Arboretum. So we don't just have the tree nursery and demo plus, we also have Arboretum to study the trees, the growth, their values in terms of the social values, the economic values. So the tree they are looking at here is called Mloliondo. This is a tree named after the famous place called Loliondo as part of the division in Ngorongoro district. So this tree is used for cultural values like the Maasai when they circumcise the man or when they are passing from one age set to the other. It's also used as a stick for elders and given for when you graduate and become a leader among the Maasai elders. So many things. Again, this is just a summer school where over 45 students was funded by the University of Cologne and Bonn. And they spent 2 weeks at Tanzania, and this was at my center. And then we also had a field school with the first field school was with these 12 Canadian students. And then we have another school and a food system. And the beauty of the Bitopia you see there is that when students come to study field school here, they don't just stay in our land, they work with our partners. So here they were at the B Center, where this center is developing different technologies on how you can actually produce honeybees from medicinal honey from non-stickless bees in the foothills of Mount Meru. So many blended training from different experts, from private to indigenous communities. And also we partner with Nelson Mandela African Institution Science and Technology, for example, for the technology-based students that are coming from Canada. The group we are seeing on both photos, this is the second field school. Second is called Tanzania Field Trip 2. These are people, a student that are studying mechatronic, the engineering in drones, robots in agriculture, and the Nelson Mandela is just the best fit. The photo on the left, I don't know, this is at our center, but this is a Nelson Mandela. And the most important thing is that all the students that come for a field school at our center, they also go to a Maasai village where they get trained by this adjunct professor who is a Maasai elder who has been educated in Ireland, but also live in his boma with a true lifestyle. The house you see is his house. That's a modern life. But on the next phase, you also have his traditional life, the Maasai houses with over 1,000 cows. So the student will go there, and these are the nursing students that are taking their masters, and they will also then do a free testing advice to communities. Okay, quickly, what are the feedback? I think this is the most important thing. So all the students that have been coming here, not all, of course, like the master's, the PhD student, I didn't have time to interview them and have survey, but about 104 students were surveyed in different trips, and most of them really agree or strongly agree that the field school training program met their preconceived expectations, and that the field school training program enhanced their basic understanding of climate change and environmental issues, like 80%, nearly 80%. So, of course, there are areas to improve because it's just 3 years old. But it's really important, I think, to really immerse people into the natural setting when you're talking about degradation. They see how it happens and how you solve it, and also student experience with the safari, and they can also recommend is very high. And why am I mentioning safari? I think this is important. So most of our students, at least every group that have came, apart from the Aga Khan, because they are mostly East Africans, we blend the field school with one of the safari in one of the national park in Tanzania, either Tarangire and Ngorongoro or Arusha National Park. Not just because they want to enjoy and see big five, the lions and so forth, but actually to see both positive and negative impact of conservation and how it could be done better and how it's also linked to climate change. And yeah, so apart from all these I just mentioned, we also just got a few big projects that we are working on. So we just have a Volkswagen project. I'm working with University of Cologne, University of Ghana, University of Western Cape in South Africa. We are looking at the medium scale farmers. So in Tanzania, I'm looking at onion farmers and rice farmers. And then I also got a Danida grant with the University of Dodoma and the Roskilde University in Denmark. We are examining the implementation of green transition investments in Tanzania, the solar, rare earth, nickel, graphite. And we also got another new project, countering collective forgetting, the role of land-based learning in Canada and Tanzania for intergenerational food literacy and resilience. This is so important to you, Philip, because what we are trying to understand is that farming is becoming an old thing. Like the young people don't like it. It's not, they don't see the value economically, all this stuff, but actually we are transitioning it. We're making it important, relevant, regionally relevant, locally relevant, reviving some of the nutritious seeds and crops. So because most of the farming is just for commercial basis, big yield, but not quality. So instead of quantity, we're looking for quality. So I'm working with one professor at Simon Fraser University, and this is a 5 years project. And then I'm also part of the bigger German group with the sustainability and resilience of agri-food value chains in times of multiple crises. That's the time of wars, the time of COVID. So it's still at the initial development phase, but it got funding for, I think, 4 years. Yeah. And then I'm also establishing a baseline which will be relevant for any partners that are coming to study here, because it has now been approved by the National Institute of Medical Research. So we're very happy with that. It's a baseline survey of public health, environmental health, nutrition to inform longitudinal surveillance cohort in Arusha and Monduli districts. So we want to sustain this for years and years. So you can look at the aging, you can look at that and that and that. The baseline will be there. Yeah, so far we have already received over 280 students. Over 15 journalists have been trained here, of course, by myself. More than 85 scholars have visited us, trying to establish partnership and engagement. There's this video online, you can look at it, so I won't have time, but thank you so much. I know I rushed, but time for you to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Well, this was a rush, but I think it was very comprehensive, and gave an excellent overview. Are there any immediate questions from the people joining. So you're all busy applauding.
Thank you.
Maybe just maybe just a quick question. What's the difference between a summer school and a field school? Is the summer school also a field school, or why do you set up both sort of modes?
Thank you. Yeah, they're slightly different. So field schools really it's largely about
Oh,
on the
Emmanuel is.
ground, but the model is a co-creation. I think my network has become unstable. So can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you again.
Good, thank you. I noticed it was unstable. So there's no major difference. The only that is that all these have different meanings. So there's even a capstone. So like the Canadian students that are coming for technical field school, that we keep it as capstone because they are coming focused on we call what am I? Mechatronics. So it's only agricultural technology focusing on drones and robots.
I
So we
see.
can't blend that with other students because it doesn't work. But field school could be comprehensive because it could cover international development studies. So it could take students from psychology, environment, and things like that. Then summer school could also be blended. So, but we also know that in a Western context, these schools means different things, and they're all linked to all cultures. So we were discussing, for example, we had a spring school organized by University of Western Cape in South Africa, funded by University of Cologne. And then there was a question that there's no spring in South Africa. So I understand they all have to vary, but the main thing is that we really emphasize on co-creating, that
Mhm.
you don't just come with all ideas of what you want to do and then just use this as a hotel. No, we want to tell you that there's actually a field visit to the Maasai elder. It will talk about the indigenous knowledge and how those have been helpful to them. So that's what it means. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Well, that helps. I have quite a few more questions, but Danielle, you were raising your hand.
Yeah, I am. Thank you, Philip. And Emmanuel, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very wide-ranging, and I'm particularly interested in the question of living labs. To give some context, some positioning for myself, I'm Australian and I'm living in the Sami homelands in Arctic Sweden, and I've been working with Living Labs for some time on food system transformation in cities around Europe. And I ask about Living Labs because you began with mentioning Living Labs, and the talk was kind of also positioned as speaking about Living Labs, and you presented such a wide range of very, very, interesting and rich projects and research undertakings. And I wonder if you might just select one example of where you really operate the project as a living lab, from however you understand that, because there are many living labs
Hmm.
can take so many different forms, as we all know, and just speak a little bit about how you do that in that particular instance, how the communities are involved, and what the nature of the work there that you're doing together is, and how that's unfolding.
Wonderful. I think this is so important question, and clearly it is an area that I need to explain more and more in my settings. Just by saying that this is a living lab and climate and environment, I only had one slide and maybe two other that are linked to that. So to be specific, most of these are other things that support this living lab to operate, to get money. So for example, these medium scale farmers project really is outside the living lab experiential learning that we're doing. So to really put into context, This is a living lab in climate and environment. That's a good name we want to use. And it focuses on experiential learning for students and researchers to use this landscape as a natural setting where students could be immersed, where researchers could be immersed to do experimentation, solution driving from those challenges that they want to address. For example, one of the projects that we are co-developing with the communities is the restoration of rangelands using the indigenous knowledge, using the indigenous trees, and at least modify it. Grasses, for example. I gave an example of a banana grass. It's not a one solution. But that is after sitting with the Maasai pastoral communities, and they really every time mention that grass or pasture is a major problem. Water is a major problem. When it's a drought, it's until it rains in the rangeland, everyone understands that. Then when you get a new fodder. So we have tested this banana grass and we are taking now to the community. So this area not only serve as a living lab, but also as a lighthouse. So some of these could be taken, like these grasses or banana grass are already in the communities, but we are now going to another crop that only need 200 millimeter of rain in a year. So we want to test all these with the communities and go with every solution that works, readjust what is not working, rework what's working. So some of the trees that we planted in our landscape, of course, before I arrived, are exotic trees. They don't really fit in the hills. So we are uprooting them because we learn from our own mistakes. Because you can't bring this ecosystem as a living lab. For example, the hills that we want to restore back to the water towers without all this learning and relearning and going back to talk to the elders and tell us what's working, what's not working. So, for example, acacia tree is an amazing tree that works here. And of course, elders are telling, yeah, you were stupid to put pines on the hills because they can't get sufficient water. And then we all even have eucalyptus, which is, of course, originated from Australia. And now we're uprooting them so that we can restore our wetlands. So many learning and unlearning that's going on in these settings that we are putting as a natural settings, as a climate and environment living lab. And then one thing, as I mentioned, is these context specificities. We are looking for the challenges that are really context specifics in these areas. One is grass, there's trees, there's food. So for example, rice. Many of the rice varieties, we don't plant them, but we want to study already extinct because most of the priorities in a food system is a commercial, it's quantity based. So these are aspects that we want to work and we co-create with the researchers that we're working from the government universities, private universities, and also research specific entities like CIFOR or Tanzania Wildlife Research Institute. I think there are many things I could say, but let me stop there. We can have extended conversation on that.
Thank you. I'm actually interested in how you are working with the communities. You mentioned co-creation a lot, but I'm interested in how that takes place. Like, you say that the living labs are there, for example, for the students to do things and to try out experiments, but do the students go and live in the communities for a week, a month, several months, or do they visit once a week? Do people sit around and have, eat together on a Sunday as part of their working process? Like how is the actual sort of process taking place? Yeah.
Good, I got you. I think that part is important. Yeah. So let me just give you a specific example of how these things unfold. There's that trachoma disease, which is part of neglected tropical diseases, and how it came, because I didn't even know because I didn't study public health in any case. So one day I had two professors. One is a professor of a health system, and the other one is a planetary health professor. We went to a Maasai village, spent time, had a coffee with a Maasai elder who is already by then not fully recruited as our adjunct professor. So we're asking, like, what are the challenges the community face? So it's an interaction, it's a discussion. That's one example of how we do. So he came up with a disease and he asked us if we can do a research and then develop a tool. So most of our research is emanate from the conversations we have with the communities either visiting us or we visit them. And in the long run, what we really want is to inject some of our community members as part of our research collaborators, but also students to spend time. So one of the group, for example, Canadian students spent a week in Nashupai village, where they actually lived in the village, in the traditional settings, and come up with ideas. And we even publish a book, we call it Photo Voice. So that's what's just a pathway. But I can honestly say that most of these are initial thinking, and some of the thinkings we already have put into place, but the trajectory is precisely that. And we also have a place to start. Simon Fraser University, we picked not just accidentally, it's because it is known as an engaged university, that the community engagement is at the center, and the research are in many ways co-created with the communities by actually inserting members of the faculty or students living in the community, but also having visits, not just to impose the ideas, but actually to co-generate ideas based on the challenges that communities are facing. So we are taking all this very seriously, and I think this is a very valuable comment. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think, Danielle, this question is really important because I also noted down, I mean, how do the living labs work? How do you engage with the communities? To which degree the locals and the communities will be able to set the research agenda as well? And how do the communities benefit from the research and the researchers that are on site on a long term? But maybe we can save this for a later or general discussions, because I think we all agree that there is a very sort of common interest amongst us on living labs. So we need to sharpen that a bit. And I think in the next sessions, we should maybe really collect a bit who has a living lab and where could be connections and learnings between the living labs. So thank you, Emmanuel, a lot. Sorry, Sulle. You always ask me to call you Sulle because there are so many Emmanuels for your presentation. And I would like to give the floor right now to Jan Kattein from London. I don't know you yet sort of personally, but I'm very impressed when I check the website about the legacy that you've been creating in uh, specifically co-designing with locals and with people, green spaces with different functions, some of them around food, some of them around gardens. And I would be very keen on sort of hearing sort of your take on that, because constantly, I think many of us might struggle or deal with the topic. How do we create ownership amongst the people, a long-standing ownership amongst the people that are having those green spaces that we're giving? And I'm very aware that is a cultural issue as well. It's very different in Taiwan than in Germany than in Brazil in terms of vandalism, in terms of taking care, in terms of individualism. So I would be very curious to sort of hear your take on that.
Great. Thanks very much. And thanks for inviting me along. This is really interesting. So we're traveling from suburban African agriculture right to one of Europe's largest metropolis. Let me see. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we see it perfectly.
Great. So I'm a practicing architect, but I'm also a lecturer of architecture engagement at University College London. I've always seen architecture as having a civic purpose. A lot of my work is situated in the action research realm, where I work with grassroots organizations to leverage social and environmental and cultural value through regeneration projects. I've put together a case study on one project, but I'll give you initially an oversight over a few other projects just to sort of frame how we ended up with the approach that I'll discuss in greater detail. So I was teaching at the Bartlett School of Architecture about 10 years ago, together with Dr. Julia King, a design unit. Designers taught in small groups at the Bartlett School of Architecture of about 15 students. And traditionally, the education is pretty self-referential. It doesn't really interact with the real world or with people on the ground very much. So Julia and I set out with the ambition to change that and to have the students work on a project that has a direct relevance to people on the ground. So we teamed up with an NGO called Global Generation. This NGO runs a number of food projects in London where they've built gardens co-created with communities in various regeneration areas. One of the biggest regeneration areas in recent years in central London is the King's Cross regeneration area. And this first project that we did there with the students that year was to build a new garden for food growing right in central London. This is almost as central as it gets, King's Cross. So the students had the amazing experience of suddenly have to do work that responds to a lay audience, not an audience that's primarily academic, but their design work was immediately relevant to people's work, and that was their audience to present to. So we very much changed the way that we worked. The students worked a lot in physical models, and ultimately then we implemented some of these structures on site. And you can see in the photographs, they're all very experimental structures. We had very limited budgets, and also Global Generation, being an environmental charity, had a strict environmental agenda. So we worked a lot with found and reclaimed materials. So that's the skip garden. This garden is no longer. It was a temporary garden. We then moved on to a new site behind the British Library, just as central in London. You can see the British Library in the bottom picture, in the bottom row in the middle. There was an empty site waiting for development, and we built the second garden again with that same charity there, this time working with Central St. Martin's, the architecture school there, and various other stakeholders, and put plans into place which were implemented through engagement processes and participation processes incrementally over a number of years to create a really big food growing area where people had small allotments. The allotments were given out to interested parties with the condition that they would need to team up with at least 2 neighbours in order to qualify for an allotment, so that the food growing activity also became a social activity as well that fostered community cohesion. The British Library abuts one of the most deprived areas in central London, with really high levels of overcrowding and access to green space and air pollution being a real challenge. So this garden in particular started to address these issues. And we also worked with that same charity, Global Generation, we were very aware that there are lots of harder to reach communities in those deprived areas, and that we'd actually need to travel to them rather than them coming to us to engage with what we were doing. So we converted an old milk float. This would have been a vehicle that traditionally the milkman would have had to deliver milk to people's homes. It's a small electric vehicle, which we converted into a community kitchen and a gardening workshop on the other side, so that this vehicle could participate in events around the local area. The top left photograph is where the vehicle drove to a community fair and started to involve people in healthy food programs and cooking together. The project that I want to discuss in slightly greater detail is the paper garden. The paper garden is located in Canada Water, which is again an area just like King's Cross, which is subject to a really ambitious master plan, which is set to deliver 3,000 homes, work and leisure spaces, retail, and biodiverse parkland. The master plan, like any big master plan, will take decades to implement. And in the meantime, the garden creates a space where existing and new communities can grow together. This is the site. It's the site of the old Daily Mail printing press in South London. You can see the printing press is the big building just in the north, and the red line indicates the initial site that we were given for the garden. On the site was a big shed, which you can see on the bottom right inset picture. The shed was used by the Daily Mail for storing paper, hence it's called the paper garden. And this was the site where we were going to set up a garden. Now, a shed doesn't provide great growing space because there's no natural light. So one of the first activities that we did was we took the paneling of the shed, and we only retained a little bit of the roofing at the far southern end of the site, where a new building would be built with a community kitchen in it to work together with a garden. Again, a key emphasis of the brief was that we would need to build with natural, sustainable, and reclaimed materials to limit the environmental impact of the project, and that became a really big focus. The other part of the brief was that this being a temporary site, the charity wanted to involve people immediately in the activities on site. So we decided to work with community volunteers to construct the garden and the building. Here are some of the volunteers working with woodlog. We did some research on vernacular construction techniques and discovered that cordwood construction is a really fantastically accessible and sustainable way of building. We worked with the City of London's forestry management team, who are looking after Epping Forest, which is one of London's last remaining ancient forests, to obtain wood from forestry management, which volunteers here are preparing on site for the build. So the project is obviously about creating the garden and creating the building that serves the garden, but it's also about promoting environmentally responsible urbanism through participative construction efforts and collaborative design processes. Circular economy principles are means to reduce material consumption, but also to engage and invest others in the project. And this is an experience that I've had, is that a lot of communities in London are incredibly concerned about the impact of climate change, but don't really feel that they have the opportunity to contribute to its mitigation. Here are some of the children that were involved in the construction effort. And you can see in the background one of the test panels of the cord wool construction. The reason we picked that material was because we could get hold of the material, because it's inherently sustainable, but also because anybody from the age of 6 to 76 can easily acquire the skills of working with it during a day-long workshop. These are some of the technical details that we developed to create a building that is not only environmentally sustainable, in terms of carbon reduction during construction, but also during operation as well. So the design needed to iterate during the construction to account for materials and skills becoming available and to incorporate the lessons learned from the production of prototypes. Circular construction is very much, the success of circular construction is very much dependent on one's ability in an agile way to respond to material flows that become available as the project progresses. And here are some volunteers finally building some of the cordwood walls. Cordwood is basically wood logs embedded in lime. The walls are incredibly thick. They have 2 leaves. They're nearly 1 meter thick and a cavity between the 2 leaves. And here children at primary school age helping to build and acquiring the skills of sustainable construction and taking the message about sustainable construction with them back home to their families. Here's another volunteering session on site, working here with reclaimed windows on one of the facades of the building. And that's the building and the garden complete. About 1.5 years ago, you can see the cordwood walls on the side, the roof that was retained from the old shed, and the garden is already incredibly green at the back, and the facade with the reclaimed windows at the front. We needed to respond again with the facade design to the windows. We knew we could get hold of really fantastic windows that were surplus to requirement, but we didn't know what size they would have. So we needed to design a structure that could accommodate a range of window sizes to respond dynamically on site to the windows that we would be able to get hold of. And here is the facade finished on the north side of the building. So ultimately, we managed to reclaim 300 railway sleepers, 200 doors, 50 square meters of floor decking, 2 disabled toilet kits, 5 kitchen appliances, 2 steel trusses, 3 steel staircases, 50 shuttering boards, and 200 meters of softwood timber battens. We used 150 cubic meters of Norwegian spruce from Epping Forest and 150 cubic meters of other wood, 8 tons of lime, and in terms of surplus materials, we were able to reuse 100 donated windows and 50 light fittings. So we didn't manage to reuse and reclaim all materials, but we reused 60% of materials by volume. But even greater, we involved over 3,000 volunteers in the construction effort, everyone going home with skills and also with perspective on sustainable construction and as advocates for the process. The Paper Garden is one of the most ambitious community-built circular projects ever undertaken in the UK, and it stands there as a piece of evidence of what can be achieved when the 3,000 people come together to help. Building with what you have is regenerative in that it mobilizes local resources to respond to civic and environmental objectives. It makes use of existing buildings, abundant materials, and available skills. Here are some of the young people that have participated in the build, and there's quite a few of them who've become really engaged and interested in sustainable construction, and I can imagine might pursue a career path in that direction. This is the interior of the building. You can see the cordwood and the railway sleepers on the left. The floors made from door blanks that were reclaimed from a building. The community kitchen on the right was taken wholesale out of a building that was being stripped out. The white walls are predominantly out of plywood, which was reclaimed from construction hoardings, and you can see the reused windows at the back as well. This is another view of the interior of the building. and the reclaimed windows again in detail. That's the garden. We are growing in planters because it's on top of an existing concrete slab, which we couldn't break up. And we're increasingly using a hugel mound technique, which involves piling wood logs and wood cuttings that are then covered with earth. And as they slowly rot, they provide nutrients for the plants growing on top. Here's a group of people cooking together the food that was grown in the garden, in the organic garden. There's a Saturday community cooking event that's been going on, and you can see the pizza oven in the background too. That's the building at night with the pizza oven on during an event. So the paper garden is a piece of true civic infrastructure that realizes educational, social, environmental, and placemaking objectives for communities in Canada Water. And we really hope that this project will become an inspiration for all those involved in designing cities. Just briefly, before I conclude, this is my book, London is Making London, and it tells the story of 9 projects, not all garden projects, a range of projects that were initiated by communities and where we were involved in assisting them implementing it. That's all I've got to present. Happy for questions. Thank you.
So thank you a lot, Jan. Super, super interesting. I have the privilege to meet you in 2 weeks, where I will have a lot of question and conversation for sure. But maybe 2 things that strike me. I think in 2 projects you've been mentioning that the temporality of the projects. And for example, here in Cologne, it's quite easy to get temporal projects, what means they kick you off if the investor decides to start building. With some ups and downsides, and some people are really fed up in wandering from one temporal place to another one. But what you built doesn't look temporal at all. I would love to have it in its spatial, social, and aesthetic quality to endure. Do you hope for getting it approved as a long-term thing, or are you living with a contract in that case that tells you, sorry, in 10 years you have to leave again?
We often start, there's a really nice, I mean, this story continues. I've told
guess.
I've told it to you to a certain extent. We're now building a permanent garden, and it took us building 4 temporary gardens on the same development site in King's Cross until we were finally given a permanent site. The charity Global Generation that we work with has signed a 999-year lease on this permanent site. It's an amazingly impressive community built. It's underway at the moment and will complete in the spring, or actually by the time it's planted, the summer this year. I'd be delighted to do another talk on that, but it sometimes takes a journey to convince people of the value that these projects bring. And the developer in King's Cross actively pursued us to accept the permanent lease on the site. But they needed to be served those temporary projects on a plate to really understand what their benefit is. It's an arduous process, but the charity we work with, by using the site creation process as an engagement process, they don't feel that a site move is necessarily a burden because it's part of their program delivery. And if one can build the co-creation into a project program, then there's so much value in the move that it doesn't matter as much.
Sure, I agree. What again is a cultural thing. I mean, in the Japanese history, it was very normal that a temple will be sort of rebuilt at another place. I think we here in Germany, architecture means to build forever. Cologne Cathedral has been started 800 years ago. But of course, there are sort of implications as well. I have a second question, but I want to give floor to Roger from Barcelona maybe first.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to say something that about the question of temporality that you already addressed, Jan, and also you, Philip, in relation to different cultural frameworks. I think that one of the interesting aspects of the work that you showed and kind of the work that or the potential work that puts us all together here is precisely in allowing to not only design but also test the values of temporality and the values of temporariness also in very radical ways. So I would be I know that typically the implications, especially in architecture, are related, especially in the West, to permanence. But I think that this is long overdue, like a radical rethinking about that. And in a way, these projects are just one of the ways, but I think a very interesting way of testing it. So there's many dimensions in which temporality may be an opportunity as opposed to simply being understood as a potential problem, right? One that Jan already mentioned, which is the fact that it's a process-based logic, the engagement, so to speak, that typically also has a lot of intensity in the beginning and not necessarily so much when things get consolidated. But then there's many other aspects, the experiential aspect, I think, but also the aspect of understanding that temporary formats should not be understood simply as subaltern formats or formats that only work in marginal liminal conditions or marginal conditions, but certainly they're formats that allow us to rethink quite radically the relationship between infrastructure and experience, for instance, right? So I think that we need to, on the one hand, open up a little bit more the definition of what permanent versus temporary is, because in a way everything is very temporary. I mean, if you go to London high rises, for instance, they're not going to last longer possibly than this building that you did, Jan, in the sense that the structure potentially will, but all the systems will be changed in less than 10 years. We know that the facades very likely in 15, 20 years, things along the lines of that. The use also will change drastically, etc. So to me, one of the things that we can learn from this process is precisely how to integrate these issues of temporality in relation, for instance, to engagement or to experience or to a sense of, I would say, co-responsibility, right, to a certain space in other formats that are not necessarily only grassroots based, and they don't necessarily only have the sort of the types of spatial operations that you can do with very limited resources and with no skill set. So it's interesting to me how, let's say, very consolidated systems of production of space can learn from these, radical grassroots initiatives and not keep them necessarily separate. Although I understand that, yes, that there's tension, very often there are tensions, right? I think that we need to think in this kind of mutual learning.
I totally agree. And I think it's some of the early projects really were done with no specific legacy planned for. But increasingly, we see the municipalities here leveraging some of the social value that the temporary projects create, also on the legacy and the permanent projects from developers. So we're having temporary projects which have created workspace on marginal sites in London, with municipalities ensuring that the permanent development will recreate workspace on the ground floors of residential buildings in order that there's a transition from for entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs that have come into these workspaces to move on afterwards. So we are increasingly seeing that there is an opportunity to see the development process much more fluid, from one stage going into the next. I mean, the thing that we often don't talk about is the huge challenge of land value that we have, in particular in London, one of the most expensive places on earth to own a piece of land. But it's going that way in lots of other cities in Europe as well. And what's wonderful about embracing temporality is that we are able to take advantage of a negative land value. We're basically taking away costs that are associated with leaving land empty. And that way we're able to provide social value without any investment. So that there's that bigger sort of macroeconomic context too, which is a really helpful factor.
Danielle, up to you.
Yeah, thank you. Jan, really fantastic to see this project. I have a question that's kind of pragmatic. Which part of the city do you work with when you're thinking about permissions for a project like this? Because the durational aspect of it would be handled very differently depending on which, if it's urban planning or which department within the city is responsible for it. When you think about how it's cared for, how it's legislated around, and all of those things that go with a city evolving. I'm just curious if you have any insights on that, or how you're thinking about it, or how the charity has been thinking about it.
Yeah, really important question. I suppose when we do these projects, we generally work with organizations that have similar objectives. It's very difficult to convince a very hard-nosed developer that they should give a site up to community. They associate risk with that. They don't really know how to handle that. But it's interesting, we work with private organizations, public organizations, and third sector organizations on these projects. And often there's a component of responsibility from all of those. So we often have third sector organizations, NGOs, that take on leases, temporary leases on sites, and take on management responsibilities for sites and run programs that open those sites to communities. So they tend to be the leaseholder or the license holder. Then we have municipalities or public organizations that sometimes own the sites. We have really high housing targets in London, and there's a lot of pressure on housing development, but it takes a while for these plans to manifest. So local authorities are often thinking about what the use could be for sites that have got long-term plans. So they are then the landowners, and they are the the lessees. So they will lease a site to often an NGO or a charity to take on. They also often provide capital funding for the works, the municipalities, because these projects implement policy objectives that they've set, i.e., job generation, healthy eating, training, community engagement, whatever those are. And the NGOs that we work with don't necessarily have access to capital funding. In particular, in relation to temporary sites, it's really difficult for them to get access to funding. So the initial infrastructure, the initial build is often funded by the public sector, and then those structures, those sites are let on a temporary lease to an NGO or third sector organization. We also have private land owners, big development companies that are funded by pension funds. One of them is British Land. The other one is the King's Cross Partnership, which is funded predominantly by Australian pension funds. And they are sort of reformed developers who really, really understand about social value and social impact. And on two sites, the paper garden I shown you and the triangle site that I just mentioned to Philip when I talked about the permanent site, they're both privately owned sites. The paper garden is on a 10-year lease to the NGO Global Generation, and the site in King's Cross that we're working on is now on a 999-year lease from the private developer to the NGO. So they all have various roles to play. And actually, as long as the objectives align, it doesn't really matter what sector the organization is in that provides the land.
Great, thank you.
I have two questions to the social and community aspect. You've been mentioning the fact that many people that are engaging see this as an opportunity to contribute to climate change mitigation through a small step. How did you find out about that? Is it in conversations? And did you find out that this maybe had a larger impact on any type of behavioral change as well, as they see a starting point right now and as they see a sort of self-efficacy?
I mean, it's interesting actually, whilst our government, and I think it's similar in Germany, has been rowing back on green pledges, that
Mm,
it's self-evident, and I suppose this is part of it. The reason for its unpopularity, the government's unpopularity, is that the community in Great Britain is incredibly aware of climate change risk and actually is really feeling the implications. We have again this winter massive flooding, which impacts on crop yields, which has meant that villages and towns are being evacuated once again this year.
mm,
We hear these stories from other continents, but it's here in Europe and it's certainly here in the United Kingdom too. So people are experiencing it in their own lives. We work a lot on the ground, running workshops, working with schools, with children, with residents, with elderly people, and it's often a thing that's being brought up. We've
mm,
also noted that if we put it on the agenda, we suddenly have lots of people attending. So having those conversations, people feel like they have a real big need to have those conversations, and it's such a big question for people that they don't really know where to start. And giving them an outlet and an opportunity to contribute is an amazingly empowering experience for lots of people.
mm,
Um, Ultimately, you're absolutely right. This is about behavior change. Um, Climate change mitigation or climate change isn't going to be solved by governments. It's going to be solved by all of us, and by all of us demanding that it is solved, and by all of us accepting that our life is going to be changed if we're going to, uh, you know, to shift the dial on it. So that awareness is certainly, being raised by the projects that we do.
mm. My second question was like when I announced sort of my take on your work, also the communities and the involvement of communities. You've shown in this last project an incredible amount of volunteers. I consider they do not feel as a community, maybe not all of them, but maybe contributing to the project. So if you start projects or if you work on projects, you have an organization who has, let's say, the ownership about the project, ownership in terms of creating decision making is very often an issue in those initiatives. Or is this also an opportunity of bringing together very different stakeholders that understand that they could build a sort of community around either Paper Garden or any other initiative?
We often work with local partners because they're already really well rooted in
Mm,
a local area and have access to all of the people we want to listen to and
mm,
whose needs we want to respond. After all, we're still architects, and we so it's quite often on these projects that we work in partnership rather than initiating them from the ground up. But we are present. we're always at the table when the conversations are being had about design, about operation, about materials, about ambition, about timescales, with members of the community. We'll be there, we'll be listening, we'll be asking questions, we'll be steering the debate, but we rarely ever go and knock on doors.
Mhm.
It's very laborsome and actually very, very difficult to get meaningful responses out of.
Mhm.
So whenever a local authority asks us to do a project, one of the first things we ask them back is, well, who are the movers and shakers locally? You know, who are the volunteers maintaining the local park? Who are the volunteers working in your library and helping out restock the books? Who are the people politically active in the resident groups? And it's to those groups that we go and say, look, there's an opportunity here. The local authority is wanting to respond to those big issues. There's a site, there's money. Would you like to work together on this?
Mhm.
So that's the level at which we engage. With schools, we often work because they're existing communities, and it's really easy
Yes.
actually if you align your outputs with the curriculum in one way or the other. You can have discussions about the real world that are aligned to what the schools have to deliver anyway.
Mhm.
It's a really great way in. But yeah, it's not often on the first tier, it's sort of on the second tier that we engage. Grassroots organizations, NGOs, schools,
Mhm.
but it's very rare that we sort of pick people up from their front door and get them
Sure.
together. So there's
Sure.
a level of organization that's there already. It's very embryonic,
Mhm.
but it's there. It helps. These organizations can act as ambassadors.
Mhm. And it feels like your role in the process is strengthening them, because I think through the very nature of architecture as a professional domain, you are understood as a curator of the project, but at one very specific moment, you're out again. Maybe if the physical architecture is built. And I think the magic thing starts then. I mean, I have no experience with the physical architecture because in many projects, you are not allowed to build anything. Sometimes you're even not allowed to dig in ground. However, I think the ambition is, especially for universities, and I think we have the privilege of being paid for our work. So once we drop out, that the volunteers will find a cohesive structure and an ownership to proceed. And I agree. I think that's the decision that we also made. Schools are an amazing example, because you've got not only the kids, you've got the teachers, you've got the parents who are taking care, and it should, can, and has to be aligned with their curriculum, especially if you look at the new European green competence framework, where basically with activities like that, we're ticking 80% of the boxes, including all the social aspects. Yes. So do we have one more questions? It's 2:30, and I think I want to do timekeeping. Some people already left. So if not, I want to thank you on behalf of those who left and put their gratitude also already in the chat. So thank you for that. And maybe as a closing remark, I think we've been coming together also to, well, of course, to learn from each other, to get to know each other, but maybe also to team up for a project together or for smaller projects. So let's have that in mind. And looking back to the conversations that came up with Emmanuel about the nature of a living lab and maybe a network of living labs, I think this could be something super interesting. When browsing through the current calls that I could oversee, at least I didn't found any specific call that exactly fits our needs. I put some on the Miro board. Let's just keep this as an ongoing thing and an invitation. If you are working on or knowing of any call, if you either want to bring yourself in as a partner, I think this could and should be the platform to discuss so. I would have loved it should be faster, but following the principles of permaculture and longevity. It takes time, and I'm not concerned about that. And I'm really happy about this regular meetings where we get to know each other, and where for sure I think many of us already see sort of connections amongst us. But I think keeping it that lightweight is great. However, if we see any opportunities, it would be very much welcome also, I think, to strengthen all our individual initiatives that we are all involved in. Saying that, I want to thank you a lot for joining again and contributing through your presence and questions. And see you again. I think it's again on the 2nd of March. Yeah, it's the same day like today, where we will have 2 presentations again. So thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
You.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.